Maggie the Mop. That was what they called her now. Megan O'Brien pushed through the double doors of Seattle General's ICU at 11:22 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that hung loose from a frame that had once carried body armor. The night shift assignment sat heavy in her chest, not the work itself, but the way Dr. Caldwell's smile had followed her across the nurse's station 3 hours ago, calculated and slow, the smile of a man holding cards he hadn't played yet. She'd seen that look before. In Tikrit. Right before things collapsed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with a sound like distant artillery fire, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made real human suffering look almost clinical. Seattle General in Norfolk smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a smell Megan had come to recognize as the scent of people's last chances. The ICU corridor stretched out in front of her, 16 beds, most of them occupied, most of them quiet except for the mechanical breathing of ventilators and the steady beep of cardiac monitors like metronomes counting down time itself. She moved through the unit with the precise economy of motion that came from 12 years of training, though only 2 of those years had been in scrubs. Megan's limp was barely noticeable now. The shrapnel had done its damage years ago, and she'd learned to compensate, to move in ways that didn't broadcast pain. A younger nurse might have called it dedication. A military-trained observer would have recognized it as damage control. Megan called it survival. At bed 5, she checked the 4 line on a 73-year-old man post-op, her hands moving with the kind of tactical precision that came from assessing triage situations under mortar fire. Equipment placements. Potential problems. Exit routes. Old habits. She knew she should have trained them out of herself months ago, but the truth was they'd kept her alive more often than not. At bed 9, she adjusted the ventilator settings for a pneumonia patient, reading the numbers on the screen like someone reading a battlefield. Oxygen saturation, 94%. Heart rate, stable at 78. Blood pressure, holding. All the vital signs that meant someone was still in the fight. Megan had spent enough time on the wrong side of those monitors to know the difference between numbers that meant recovery and numbers that meant goodbye. And then she passed bed 7. The room was dimmer than the others, as if the machines themselves had accepted defeat. Captain James Riker lay motionless in the center of that carefully controlled darkness, his frame wasted from 2 years of immobility, his face slack with the kind of unconsciousness that had no timeline. No prognosis. No promises. The ventilator moved his chest in its mechanical rhythm, a sound like the steady metronome of a world that had already forgotten him. Megan's hand moved to her scrub pocket without her consciously directing it, her fingers finding the broken dog tag on a fractured silver chain, the only remaining proof that Major Megan O'Brien had ever existed outside this hospital. She didn't enter the room. Not yet. She stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds, her jaw tightening under the fluorescent lights, her free hand gripping the doorframe hard enough that the tendons stood out like tent ropes under her skin. The captain had court-martialed her in Tikrit 8 years ago. Had destroyed her career with a single command. Had ensured that when the shrapnel came, when she took the blast meant for 3 of his soldiers, there was no Ranger battalion waiting for her when she came home. No unit. No family. No identity. Just a discharge and a bottle of pain medication and a burning need to disappear. So she had disappeared. She'd become Megan instead of Major. A nurse instead of a warrior. A ghost that nobody looked at twice. Her fingers released the dog tag, and she continued down the corridor to the nurse's station. Dr. Caldwell was there, of course. He was always there, at least in spirit, his presence occupied space even when his body didn't. He sat at the central desk, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light like a predator's eyes in darkness. The watch cost more than Megan's monthly rent, which meant either inherited money or the kind of career advantage that came from knowing the right people. Probably both. Men like Caldwell didn't rise through the ranks on competence alone. Megan began her charting, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same mechanical rhythm as the ventilators. Notes on each patient. Vital signs. Observations. The language of medicine that required no emotion, no judgment, just facts. Dr. Caldwell's eyes tracked her movement across the screen without actually looking at her, a dismissal so complete it was almost impressive. 2 weeks ago, she had witnessed something. The detail was small enough that she'd almost let it pass, the kind of thing that shouldn't matter in a hospital where people were already dying of more immediate causes. Caldwell had switched medication logs between patient files. Not dramatically. Not with the theatrical flourish of someone committing grand larceny. Just a quick substitution while the night staff was busy with a patient crash in bed 3, his movements efficient enough that she'd almost talked herself into believing she'd misread it. Almost. But Megan had spent 8 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and you didn't develop the ability to read a room under fire and then forget how to read a doctor manipulating hospital records. She'd seen the switched logs. She'd noted the dates. She'd counted the patients whose medications didn't match their diagnoses. 12 patients over 3 weeks. The pattern was too clean, too organized, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. And Caldwell knew that she knew. The night shift rolled forward in that strange, timeless way that hospital nights always did. 3 a.m. felt like 7 p.m. 7 a.m. felt like it was still the same day that had never ended. Megan moved through her rounds with the same quiet competence that had kept her invisible for 2 years, check the vitals, adjust the meds, note the changes, move to the next bed. She was a machine because machines couldn't be hurt, and they couldn't be destroyed by men who smiled the way Caldwell smiled. At 2:16 a.m., the overhead page crackled through the unit with the sound of static tearing open. Maggie the mop to ICU. Patient in bed 7 needs cleanup. The nurse's station erupted. Not loudly, hospital staff were trained in discretion, but the laughter was there, barely contained, rippling through the night shift like current through water. Maggie the mop. The floor nurse who wasn't a floor nurse. The orderly who wasn't an orderly. The woman nobody looked at twice because she was the kind of invisible that came from accepting her place at the bottom of the hierarchy. For nurses at the station exchanged glances that had teeth in them. Dr. Caldwell's smile widened without changing the expression in his eyes. Megan stood. Her movements were smooth. Practiced. The kind of smooth that didn't betray the fact that her hands had gone cold. She took one measured breath, and something flickered across her face, just for a moment, something that looked like tears but couldn't be, because Major Megan O'Brien had stopped crying somewhere between her 14th and 15th combat deployment and had never found her way back to it. The page was a message. A test. A declaration of intent. She reached for the cleaning cart at the edge of the station without looking at anyone. Her limp was more pronounced now, not from pain but from the kind of tension that made muscles forget how to work correctly. She was aware of being watched. For sets of eyes. Then 5. The weight of their attention felt like a target. Right away, she said quietly, and her voice was exactly what they expected, deferential, apologetic, small. The voice of someone who had accepted their place and wasn't going to make trouble about it. I'll take care of it. She pushed the cleaning cart toward bed 7, and the room swallowed her whole. The ventilator sound was louder inside the room, that mechanical breathing that had become the background noise of Captain Riker's entire existence for 730 days. Megan stood beside the bed for a moment, not moving, just existing in the space with the man who had destroyed her. His chest rose and fell with the regularity of a metronome. His monitors beeped their quiet songs. His full lines dripped medications that were keeping him alive in a state that Megan, trained in triage, trained in assessing who could be saved and who couldn't, would have classified as something between life and death. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the dog tag on the broken chain. The metal was worn smooth from 8 years of being touched, turned over, worried like a prayer beads in the hands of someone who hadn't prayed in longer than she could remember. The engraving on the back had been done by her unit medic in 2016, Major O'Brien. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 tours. That was who she'd been. That was the woman who had held her soldiers' organs in and kept them breathing and called in the medevac while taking fire from 2 rooftops and a reinforced position in the Jolin district. That was the officer who had earned the respect of men who had no respect for anything but competence and sacrifice. And then Captain Riker had decided her sacrifice wasn't necessary anymore. She looked at his motionless face, at the monitors, at the 4 lines carrying medication and nutrition into a body that couldn't accept either. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself imagine what would happen if she did nothing. If she simply turned off the alarms. If she stopped checking his vitals. If she let what was already happening in his brain cells and his damaged nervous system simply finish what it had started 2 years ago. Then she clipped the dog tag back to the broken chain, tucked it underneath her scrubs, and picked up the cleaning supplies. What happened next changed everything. The supply closet smelled of antiseptic and stale cardboard. Megan was restocking 4 bags when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, blocking her exit with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never been told no. His phone glowed in his hand, displaying a transfer order in bright white text. Psychiatric ward. Effective immediately. Sign this, he said. Not a request. A command delivered like poison in a wine glass. Megan's hands continued their work, 3 bags of normal saline, 2 of lactated ringers, steady as a surgeon's. She didn't look at him yet. The fluorescent lights above them cast everything in surgical white. Or, Caldwell continued, stepping closer, I'll make sure you never work in medicine again. You're just a floor nurse who doesn't know her place. Frankly, Maggie, you're not even good at that. The nickname landed like a fist. Maggie the mop. The entire shift had heard it broadcast across the intercom that morning. The laughter had followed her down the hallway like shrapnel. Megan's hand trembled as she reached for a box of gauze, not from fear, but from the weight of restraint, from muscles trained for combat now forced to stay still. One tear slid down her face, and she let it fall without wiping it away. When she spoke, her voice emerged like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. I know exactly where I belong, Doctor. She turned to face him fully, and for one suspended moment, something shifted in the air pressure between them. Her eyes held the kind of calm that comes only from having already survived the worst. Caldwell's confidence flickered, just for a second, before he laughed and pocketed his phone, uncomfortable with the silence that followed. You have until Monday, he said, and left. She waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor before she wiped her face. Then she finished restocking with the precision of someone who'd prepared full lines under mortar fire. Muscle memory. Her hands would obey her mind. They always did. At 1900 hours, shift change erupted in the parking lot like organized chaos. Arriving nurses clustered near the entrance, tired from their commutes, chatting about the weekend. Megan was walking toward the building when Caldwell's voice cut across the lot, loud enough to turn 15 heads. Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to our newest orderly. He gestured toward her like a magician revealing a trick. Megan here has been demoted effective immediately for repeatedly exceeding her competency level. Seems she doesn't understand chain of command. The air went still. Even the rain hesitated. Megan could feel their eyes on her, the new nurses who didn't know her, the veterans who'd watched her work. She reached into her scrub pocket and pressed her fingers against the dog tag hanging on its broken chain. The metal was cold. Real. Proof that she had been someone else once. Someone with rank. Someone with authority. She clutched it without removing it. Her composure held like a dam holding back a reservoir. One tear tracked down her face, she wiped it with one deliberate motion, her jaw clenched so tight it could have cut glass, and then she walked past all of them toward the hospital entrance without a word. Bedpans and mop duty, Caldwell called after her, his voice carrying across the parking lot. Seems more her speed. The door slid open and she stepped inside. The hallway was cool and humming with the distant sound of ventilators and cardiac monitors. She stood for a moment in the lobby, her hand still pressed against the dog tag under her scrubs, feeling it anchor her to something these people couldn't see. Couldn't touch. Couldn't take away no matter how hard they tried. She'd been medically discharged 8 years ago. The shrapnel from Tikrit had lodged too deep to remove surgically. They'd said it was near her femoral artery, that the risk of extraction outweighed the benefit of leaving it. She'd spent 3 months in Walter Reed recovering, and when the doctors finally cleared her for discharge, they'd offered her a choice: take the military pension and the disability rating, or walk away completely. She'd walked away. For 8 years, she'd existed in civilian white space. No uniform. No rank. No unit. Just a nurse in a hospital somewhere in Norfolk, where nobody knew her name and nobody cared what she'd accomplished before the uniform came off. She'd been invisible, and she'd chosen that. Invisibility was safety. Invisibility was peace. But invisibility also meant that when a man like Dr. Caldwell decided you were disposable, you had no armor to hide behind. No institution that would defend you. No brothers and sisters in arms ready to come home from deployment and set things right. She'd rebuilt herself as a civilian. That had taken longer than combat ever had. Muscle memory faded with time. Trauma responses dulled with therapy. She'd learned how to work in a hospital without seeing the faces of Marines she couldn't save. She'd learned how to hear the monitors without hearing the sound of helicopters. She'd learned how to talk to families without using the words body bag or KIA. All of that had been intentional. Deliberate. A choice she'd made and remade every single day for 8 years. And then Captain Riker had come to Seattle General in a coma, and everything she'd buried had surfaced like a corpse rising from deep water. Over the next week, Caldwell's moves came with the precision of a man trained in institutional politics. Megan arrived for her Tuesday shift to find her schedule transformed: the dementia ward, the opposite side of the hospital, 3 floors down from the ICU where the real work happened. On Wednesday, she caught sight of Nurse Chen being escorted to the cardiac unit. Chen had been there when Megan caught a medication error that would have killed a 74-year-old with atrial fibrillation. She'd been a witness. By Friday, every nurse who'd worked alongside Megan had been shuffled like cards in a rigged deck. Different departments. Different shifts. Different hospitals for 2 of them. Her access badge stopped working at the ICU doors. Now she had to be buzzed in by security, and the security guard, a nervous kid named Torres, had been given explicit instructions to log every time she entered. The break room became a minefield. She was sitting alone at a corner table with cold coffee and a turkey sandwich she wasn't eating when she caught Caldwell's voice from the adjacent room. The door was open just enough. She could hear him. "Yes, I need you to fast-track the termination hearing. I have 3 department heads ready to testify, and the board meeting is set for Monday morning. 0900 hours. Pause. No, I'm confident. She won't have legal representation she can afford. She'll fold." Megan's hand moved to her pocket. The dog tag was there, tucked against her sternum under the scrubs. She didn't remove it. She just pressed her fingers against the fabric and felt the outline of it: her name, her service number, her blood type. The last physical evidence that the woman sitting in this break room had ever been anything other than an orderly. Her termination hearing was set for Monday. 72 hours away. That night, she made a decision that would have cost her a dishonorable discharge if she'd still been in uniform. She clipped her badge to the dementia ward assignment, but instead of going directly to her floor, she took the elevator to the ICU. Torres wasn't watching the door, he was dealing with an emergency on the 4th floor. She slipped past the threshold without being logged. The ICU lights were always too bright and never bright enough at the same time. Machines beeped their mechanical rhythms. Ventilators wheezed in that particular way that meant the lungs underneath them had given up trying. She walked down the hallway, past occupied beds, past families that had learned to sleep in chairs designed for discomfort. Bed 7 was at the far end. Captain James Riker lay exactly as he'd been for 2 years, unchanged, unremarkable, just a collection of biological data continuing its patterns without consciousness. His vitals were stable. Heart rate 62. Blood pressure 118/74. Oxygen saturation 97%. The monitor showed a man who was technically alive and institutionally dead. She stood outside his room looking in, and for a moment she let herself remember why he'd court-martialed her in Tikrit. It had been a Friday. A routine patrol that became an ambush. 3 soldiers down, 1 critical, and the medical support chopper was 40 minutes out. She'd performed a resuscitative hysterotomy on a pregnant civilian she'd found in the rubble, not by the book, not authorized, not within her scope of practice. The woman had lived. The child had lived. She'd gone back to her unit expecting commendation. Instead, Riker had written her up for exceeding her authority. For operating outside military medical protocol. For saving a life without explicit command. The court-martial had been quiet and efficient and utterly final. Now he lay in a coma, and she was an orderly, and Dr. Caldwell didn't know she was standing 3 feet away from him in the dark corridor. She was about to leave when she heard voices near the nurses' station. Caldwell was there, talking to one of the ICU nurses. She heard her own name. She heard the words unauthorized personnel and loitering and potential HIPAA violations. Without moving, without giving any sign she'd heard, she turned and walked back the way she came. The elevator descended. The doors closed. What happened next changed everything. The doors of the ICU closed behind her, and she was alone with a man who'd destroyed her career, finally ready to see if anything remained of the officer who'd sworn to protect his soldiers. Megan's hand trembled as she reached for his chart, then caught herself. Not here. Not ever in public. She steadied her fingers against the cool metal clipboard, breathing through her nose the way Captain Halloway had taught her in Kandahar when panic wanted to win. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside Riker's bed, in, out, the sound of a man whose body was still fighting even when his mind had surrendered to darkness 2 years ago. She read his vitals, stable, unremarkable, the kind of patient who got rounds twice a day and prayers at night and very little else. She didn't touch him. Not yet. She just stood there, watching the rise and fall of his chest, remembering a different version of this man, one who'd worn his uniform like it meant something, who'd ordered her into a tribunal in Tikrit and called her a liability, who'd taken her Silver Star recommendation and buried it in classified files because she'd survived when 3 other soldiers hadn't, and that survival made him uncomfortable. The clock on the wall showed 23:19. 13 minutes until Sunday became Monday. 13 minutes until her shift ended and she would slip out of Seattle General like she'd never been there at all. She was reaching for the door when the first alarm shrieked. Not just a beep. A full arterial shriek, the sound of a body in revolt. Megan spun. Riker's monitor showed respiratory distress so severe the numbers looked like fiction. Oxygen saturation dropping, a 92. 87, 81. His trachea was deviating. The ventilator was doing nothing. Tension pneumothorax. The pressure inside his chest cavity was collapsing his lung, compressing his heart, suffocating him from the inside. Cardiac arrest in maybe 4 minutes if nothing changed. She hit the call button and moved simultaneously, not a choice, just the way her body had learned to operate under fire. Muscle memory was real. It lived in your hands long after your mind tried to forget the context that built it. The on-call resident arrived in 19 seconds. 32-year-old Dr. Patterson, competent enough during rounds, panic-stricken under pressure. He stared at the monitor like it might rearrange itself if he looked hard enough. "I need to call Caldwell," he stammered. "I don't have authorization for emergency thoracotomy, I need." "Call him." Megan was already at the crash cart. No chest tube kit. Someone hadn't restocked after the last emergency. Of course they hadn't. His phone's off. Then we wait for. We have for minutes before cardiac arrest. She said it the way she'd said it in Tikrit, flat, informational, no room for negotiation. Maybe less. Patterson looked at her, really looked at her, and in his eyes she saw him trying to reconcile the orderly who'd been pushing mops 2 hours ago with the person standing in front of him now with her posture wrong and her voice dropping 2 octaves. She could see the moment he decided she might know something after all. Megan ran. The break room was 40 meters from the ICU. She covered it in 8 seconds. Her locker was still there, still held the same small habit she'd never managed to break, the canteen filled daily even though she drank from the tap, the MRE packet she'd kept from deployment like some soldiers kept rosaries or lucky coins. She grabbed one without looking, beef stew, dated 2019, a relic from another life. The plastic wrapper was sterile. MRE packaging was designed to survive worse than hospital procedure rooms. She knew this the way she knew her blood type and her service number and the precise angle at which shrapnel entered human flesh. 90 seconds round trip. Riker's saturation was 68 when she returned. She didn't ask permission anymore. That was the other thing about stepping back into uniform, even just borrowing its language. You didn't phrase things as questions. She took off his shirt, found the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line the way she'd been trained, the way she'd done it with a 14-gauge needle while incoming mortars were shaking the forward operating base and 3 soldiers were bleeding out and she was the only medic standing. The plastic wrapper went across the puncture site, sealed with her hands and a prayer the fluorescent lights would stay on. Needle decompression. The hiss of air escaping. O2 climbing, 75. 82, 88. Normal sinus rhythm reasserting itself like a soldier standing up after being knocked down. Riker's monitor showed normal. His saturation held. Patterson was standing frozen with his phone in his hand, watching a floor nurse save his patient's life in approximately 90 seconds of controlled motion he hadn't known human beings were capable of. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish. He managed a single word, "How?" "Tikrit," Megan said quietly. "Practice." Dr. Caldwell arrived 20 minutes later, his hair disheveled in a way that suggested he'd been asleep when he got the page, his eyes clearing as he processed the scene. Riker stable. Vitals normal. The monitor showing nothing but good news. He stood in the doorway for exactly 7 seconds, Megan counted, and then his face rearranged itself. Not shock. Something colder. "Who authorized this procedure?" His voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. Patterson pointed at Megan. She was already removing her gloves, dropping them into the biohazard container like she'd never been anything except what she appeared to be. Just a nurse. Just an orderly who'd been in the wrong place at the right moment. Caldwell stepped into the room, his eyes moving from Riker to the improvised chest seal to the empty MRE wrapper on the table. He was fast. His mind was moving faster than Patterson's, faster than most people's. She could see him trying to fit the pieces together. How did the mop pusher know procedure? How did her hands move like that? Where did she get access to medical supplies she wasn't authorized to touch? "You performed an emergency needle decompression without physician authorization," he said slowly. Each word was precisely placed, a man building a case while he spoke. "You created an improvised medical device. You treated a patient without a license." He paused. "On a patient whose care you're explicitly not assigned to." He was crashing, Patterson said weakly. "She saved his life. She violated protocol." Caldwell's smile appeared, thin and sharp as a scalpel. "She committed a felony. And she just gave me the documentation I need to make sure she never works in medicine again." He looked at Megan directly for the first time. "You're finished here." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breathing. Megan met his eyes without flinching, the kind of stare that comes from someone who'd made life-or-death decisions while bombs were falling and understood that fear was just information. She didn't blink. She didn't defend herself. She just held his gaze while he tried to figure out who he was actually looking at and came up empty. "Call it emergency medicine under duress," she said quietly. "Call it civilian liability. Whatever language you need." She turned toward the door. "I'm going on break." She walked past him into the corridor, and she knew, with the absolute certainty that comes from surviving war and everything after it, that the man was already planning his next move. That he'd gotten exactly what he needed to destroy her. That the mercy she'd shown Captain Riker had just handed her enemy the weapon he needed. Behind her, she could hear Caldwell's voice, low and calm, already composing his formal complaint to the medical board before her footsteps even reached the end of the hallway. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that he was right. She had violated protocol. She had performed a procedure beyond her scope. And she had done it with the precision of someone trained to make those exact calls when lives were on the line, which meant that no court and no hospital review board would ever see it as an orderly improvising under pressure. They would see it as evidence. Proof of something she'd spent 8 years trying to hide. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 0220 hours, 20 minutes after the crash cart had been wheeled away and Captain Riker's oxygen saturation climbed back to 94%. He stopped at the nurse's station, reading the monitor strips with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a surgical site, his eyes catching on the timestamps that marked Megan's intervention. The fluorescent lights cast him in sharp relief, his face smooth, unreadable, calculating. He didn't speak to her. Not yet. He simply turned and walked to his office. The first call came at 02 for 5 hours. Megan was still in the ICU, updating Riker's chart with meticulous detail, documenting every intervention, every vital sign, leaving no room for ambiguity. Her hands moved with the precision of someone trained in field medicine, each notation a timestamp that proved what she'd done. She heard Dr. Caldwell's voice through the walls, low and measured, speaking to someone on the hospital's medical board. "I need to report a serious incident of scope creep by nursing staff," he said, his tone carrying the weight of professional concern. "A patient was endangered. An unauthorized procedure. We need to discuss immediate action before this escalates into a liability issue." 3 hours later, at 0600 hours, 2 formal complaints had been submitted to the department heads, neatly typed, meticulously documented, each one listing violations of hospital policy with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Caldwell had included statements from 3 nurses he'd coached in the hallway outside Riker's room, nurses who suddenly remembered seeing things they hadn't actually witnessed. The narrative was simple: Major O'Brien had acted without physician authorization. She had endangered the patient. She had no medical license to perform the procedures she'd undertaken. The documents read like a prepared closing argument. At 0830 hours, security arrived at the ICU. 2 officers in Navy uniforms with radios clipped to their belts. Megan was still charting, her pen moving across the page in controlled movements, documenting Riker's stable vitals, his improving blood pressure, the successful intervention that had saved his life. One of the security officers, a man named Torres, who'd always nodded to her in the cafeteria, placed a hand near her elbow. "We need you to come with us," he said quietly, and the entire ICU went still. Nurses looked away. The monitors continued their mechanical rhythm. Beeping. 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 Dr. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station, his arms crossed, watching her perp walk with the satisfied expression of a man executing a carefully laid plan. His posture was relaxed, his face composed, but his eyes carried the cold calculation of someone who understood institutional power and knew exactly how to weaponize it. Megan didn't look at him as she was escorted from the unit. She kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, her composure intact even as the weight of humiliation pressed against her chest like a physical force. She'd survived mortar fire. She'd survived shrapnel. This was a different kind of wound, one that cut at the person she'd tried so hard to become. Within 48 hours, every nurse who'd been in that ICU room when she performed the needle decompression had been reassigned. Nurse Patricia Chen, who'd brought her the MRE package from her personal locker. Nurse Marcus Williams, who'd confirmed the patient was crashing. Nurse David Rothstein, who'd helped position Riker's body. All of them shuffled to different floors, different shifts, different corners of the hospital where their testimony would be compartmentalized and worthless. Dr. Caldwell moved through the staffing office with the smooth efficiency of a master strategist, his requests always framed in terms of better resource allocation and skill-appropriate assignments. By Tuesday morning, the duty schedule had been completely restructured. Megan's shifts no longer overlapped with anyone who could corroborate her account of what had happened in that room at 0200 hours. The calls to hospital board members began on Tuesday afternoon. Caldwell's voice on the phone was measured, concerned, almost regretful. "I'm worried about her," he told each administrator. She seems to be experiencing some kind of dissociative episode, treating a former commanding officer, acting without authorization, risk-taking behavior that suggests she's not in a stable mental state. We need to consider her fitness for duty before she harms someone. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. She was unstable, she was dangerous, she needed to be removed. His competence was terrifying. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply constructed a narrative so airtight, so meticulously detailed, so institutional in its logic, that no one asked questions. The termination hearing was fast-tracked to Thursday morning. On Wednesday night, Megan sat in her car in the parking garage of Seattle General, the engine dead, her forehead pressed against the cold steering wheel. The parking garage was empty except for the night shift vehicles scattered in the shadows. Somewhere above her, in bed 7 of the ICU, Captain James Riker was breathing steadily, his oxygen saturation stable, his vitals normal, alive because she'd acted without hesitation, without thinking about rank or authority or the man who'd court-martialed her in Tikrit 8 years ago. And now he would testify against her. He would have to. The hospital board would ask him what happened, and he would tell them the truth, that she'd operated without a physician's authorization. That she'd broken protocol. That she'd endangered his safety by taking action outside the scope of her nursing license. She couldn't move. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, but the rest of her body had shut down, collapsing under the weight of losing everything twice. The first time had been sudden, a court-martial in a forward operating base, her career ending in a captain's office, her discharge paper signed with finality. This time was slower, more calculated, more humiliating. They were going to strip away her license, her reputation, her ability to help anyone ever again. And they would do it while the man she'd saved lay in the hospital bed she'd fought to keep him in. Her right hand unclenched from the steering wheel, reaching into her scrub pocket. The dog tag was there, a single piece of metal on a broken chain, the engraving worn nearly smooth from years of being clutched in moments exactly like this. Major Megan O'Brien. Medical Officer. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her birth date. Her blood type. Her identification stripped down to the essentials of who she used to be. She'd kept it hidden for 8 years, sewn into the lining of her civilian jackets, moved from purse to purse, held close in dark moments when the weight of invisibility pressed too hard against her chest. In 16 hours, none of it would matter. Her service record, her decorations, her rank, they would all be irrelevant against the institutional machinery that Dr. Caldwell had set in motion. He'd isolated her completely. Every witness had been scattered. Every piece of evidence had been reframed as proof of her incompetence rather than her heroism. He'd constructed a narrative so tight, so institutional, so professionally presented, that the hospital board would have no choice but to accept it. She'd become the problem that needed to be eliminated. The dog tag pressed into her palm, cold and small and utterly useless. It couldn't protect her career. It couldn't explain to the hospital board who she really was. It couldn't change the fact that she'd broken the rules to save a man who destroyed her first life. She just sat there in the darkness of the parking garage, the metal tag clutched in her fist, unable to cry because she'd stopped crying 8 years ago in Tikrit when the discharge papers were signed. The weight of losing everything twice had finally crushed through the careful composure she'd constructed, and what remained underneath was hollow and cold and very, very alone. The background check came back at 08 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning, and it stopped everything. The HR director's hands shook as she read the screen, the classified security clearance flag rendering Megan's entire personnel file temporarily inaccessible to civilian systems. Red banner. Restricted access. The words beneath made her breath catch. Defense Intelligence Agency. National Security Clearance. Active status. She picked up the phone and made a call she'd never made before in her 23 years at Seattle General, a call to the Pentagon's Civilian Liaison Office. By noon, the termination hearing had been moved to an emergency closed-session board meeting with federal observers present. The conference room on the 15th floor smelled of mahogany and old money and the particular cold that happens when powerful people realize they've made a mistake. The board members sat in silence. Dr. Caldwell stood near the window, his posture still rigid with the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. The FBI agent Torres sat in the back corner, her presence felt rather than obvious. Megan stood at the far end of the table in her scrubs, just a nurse, still invisible, still small. Ryan Riker's daughter Sarah sat in the first chair, trembling. She was 24 years old and had visited her father every day for 2 years while he lay comatose, and now she gripped the edge of the conference table as if it were the only thing holding her to the earth. The board chair nodded to Sarah. She stood. Her voice cracked on the first word. She's not just a nurse. She's Major O'Brien. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been staring at a legend and calling her Maggie the Mop. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued. My father told me everything when he woke up. He remembered. He remembered her. Caldwell's jaw clenched. His eyes flicked to the door, calculating distance, calculating escape vectors. The board chair opened a manila folder, the newly unsealed file from the National Archives. A woman named Henderson, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, picked it up with hands that shook slightly. She was 72 years old and had never read a military service record in her life, and the weight of it seemed to bend her shoulders. She cleared her throat. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Army Commendation Medal with Valor device. She paused between each one, letting each sentence fall like a judge's gavel. The room didn't breathe. Outside the windows, Seattle spread out indifferent, the bay water catching light like shattered glass. The door opened. Everyone turned. Commander Marcus Hayes wheeled himself in, navy blue dress uniform immaculate, his left leg amputated below the knee from an IED blast in Sanjin Valley 4 years ago. He'd been on the 4th floor of Seattle General receiving prosthetic fittings for the last 6 months, and he'd heard about the hearing from Sarah Riker, who worked the trauma ward and knew everybody's story. Hayes positioned his wheelchair at the head of the table with the precision of a man who'd spent months learning his new geometry. He didn't ask permission. He didn't offer apologies. I'm Commander Marcus Hayes, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, he said. His voice carried the particular weight of someone who'd given significant pieces of himself for his words to matter. Major Megan O'Brien led the counterinsurgency operation in Tikrit that saved my entire platoon in 2019. She refused an order that would have resulted in civilian casualties. She disobeyed a direct command from her superior officer because she knew that intelligence was wrong. He paused. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. She's earned the Defense Superior Service Medal and the Legion of Merit. She's the most decorated officer I've ever served alongside, and I've served alongside Medal of Honor recipients. Hayes's eyes found Caldwell's. And you tried to fire her. Dr. Caldwell's face drained of all color. The strategic mind that had orchestrated a 6-month campaign against Megan O'Brien suddenly confronted with the fact that he'd been playing chess against someone who'd operated at a level he couldn't comprehend. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came out. The silence stretched like rubber being pulled too thin. Agent Torres stood then. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent the last 6 months watching Dr. Caldwell on surveillance cameras, tracking his pharmaceutical contacts, recording his conversations. She placed a single document on the conference table. We've been investigating Dr. Caldwell's opioid diversion scheme for 187 days, Torres said. Cash payments to distributor representatives. Phone records showing coordination with 3 pharmaceutical sales representatives and these. She spread out 8 additional documents. Forged medical evaluations attempting to discredit Major O'Brien. Altered witness statements. Falsified duty logs designed to make her appear unstable and unreliable. You attempted to destroy federal military service records, Doctor. You attempted to discredit a federal witness in a criminal investigation. The handcuffs came out smooth and practiced. Torres read rights in a voice that carried no satisfaction, no judgment, just procedure, just facts, just the weight of consequences arriving on schedule. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The cuffs clicked around Caldwell's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo. His white coat hung on the back of a chair, abandoned. His strategic advantage had evaporated between one breath and the next. The board members watched in silence as FBI agents flanked him, moving toward the door with the fluid precision of people doing this exact operation hundreds of times. Caldwell's eyes found Megan's as they walked him past the table. He was looking for something: anger, satisfaction, vindication. Instead, he found the same composed expression she'd worn for 8 years, the face of someone who'd already won and simply hadn't bothered to celebrate it. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She watched him leave with the same quiet dignity she brought to every moment, every shift, every impossible thing. His mouth moved soundlessly. Maybe he was trying to explain. Maybe he was trying to apologize. Maybe he was simply understanding, for the first time, that he'd been trying to destroy a woman who'd spent her career rebuilding what others had broken, and in doing so, he'd broken nothing except himself. The perp walk happened at 09 for 5 hours. Security footage later showed Dr. Caldwell moving through the main lobby of Seattle General, hands cuffed behind his back, agents on either side, his white coat stripped away. Local news cameras were already there, someone had tipped them off. Nurses lined the hallway, silent witnesses to the fall of a man who'd terrorized them with calculated cruelty for years. The fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical song. His badge clattered to the floor with a sound like glass breaking. Nobody picked it up. By 1400 hours, the medical board had suspended his license. By 1700 hours, his lawyer was negotiating a plea deal in a county holding cell. 8 federal counts. 20 years minimum. Caldwell signed away 7 of those years with shaking hands, understanding finally that he'd lost everything by trying to destroy someone he'd catastrophically underestimated. The strategic mind that had gotten him this far couldn't calculate escape from this. There was no angle. There was no move. There was only consequence, arriving exactly on time, cold and inevitable. Megan stood in the empty conference room after everyone had left, the afternoon light slanting through the windows at precisely the angle that made everything look temporary. Sarah Riker hugged her, fierce and shaking. Commander Hayes extended his hand. The board members filed past with nods that carried the weight of apologies they didn't have words for. She accepted all of it with the same measured breath, the same composed exterior, because that's what you did when you'd learned a long time ago in Tikrit that the greatest power wasn't in celebrating your victories, it was in never letting anyone see that you needed to. The dog tag hung openly now on a new chain around her neck, visible above her scrubs, no longer a hidden thing, no longer something clutched in darkness. She touched it once, briefly, feeling the cool metal against her skin. Major Megan O'Brien had walked into Seattle General as an invisible orderly. She was walking out as something else entirely, not just a nurse, not just a soldier, but a person whose quiet strength had just reshaped the entire institution around her. The real work was about to begin. Subscribe for more stories of heroes you've never heard of, soldiers you'll never meet, and the quiet people who change the world when nobody's watching. Like this video if you believe in second chances. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And follow us, because the best stories always come when the world stops looking.